A crying horse leads a police officer deep into the forest, desperate for him to follow. When they arrive at a dried-up stream, he finds the horse's foal trapped and exhausted. But as he looks closer, he sees something shocking that changes everything: a hidden dam, barrels of toxic waste, and evidence of a dangerous cover-up. Who's behind it? And how far will they go to keep the truth buried? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty patrol car as Jake Warren drove slowly along the winding country road. His eyes swept over the parched fields on either side, taking in the brittle yellow grass and cracked earth. The sight made his heart heavy. He'd grown up in a farming country just like this, and he knew exactly what this drought meant for the local families trying to make a living off the land. Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. Even with the car's air conditioning running full blast, the heat was oppressive. Through his open window, he could hear the hot wind rustling through the dying cornfields. A sudden movement in the road ahead caught his attention. Jake eased his foot onto the brake as a large chestnut horse appeared, standing squarely in the middle of the road. The horse's sides were heaving, and it let out a distressed whinny that made Jake's chest tighten with concern. "Easy there," Jake said softly, putting his car in park and stepping out slowly. The horse, Scout, he recognized from previous patrols, paced nervously, pawing at the ground with one hoof. As Jake approached with his hands raised, Scout reached out and tugged at his jacket sleeve with gentle teeth. "What's wrong, boy?" Jake asked, reaching up to pat Scout's neck. The horse immediately pulled away, taking a few steps toward a dirt track that branched off the main road. When Jake didn't follow right away, Scout came back and nudged him hard in the chest. Jake's police instincts kicked in. "You trying to show me something?" Scout whinnied again, more urgently this time, and started down the dirt track. Jake followed, his boots kicking up dust with each step. The horse led him toward what used to be Miller's Creek, now just a sad trickle of water in a muddy bed. That's when he heard it, a weak neighing sound coming from below the bank. Jake carefully made his way down the steep slope and found a small foal trapped in the thick, sticky mud. The young horse was clearly exhausted, her head barely held above the muck. "Oh no," Jake breathed, immediately recognizing Elena Morales' foal, Daisy. He clicked on his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Warren. I need the vet out to the old Miller's Creek bed, just off Route 7. Got a horse stuck in the mud." For the next hour, Jake worked carefully to free the frightened foal, speaking in low, soothing tones to both Daisy and the anxious Scout. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and pinks, he finally managed to help Daisy scramble up onto solid ground. The foal was weak and trembling, covered in drying mud. Jake knew Elena's ranch was closest, just over the next rise. He gently encouraged both horses to follow him, Scout hovering protectively near her foal's side. When they reached the ranch house, Elena Morales rushed out onto her porch, her eyes widening at the sight of her mud-caked horses. "Scout? Daisy, what in the world happened to you two?" The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Jake pulled up to Elena's ranch. The gravel crunched under his boots as he made his way to the barn, where he found Elena brushing Scout's coat. Daisy lay on a bed of fresh hay nearby, still tired, but looking much better than the previous evening. "Officer Warren," Elena said, offering a warm smile. "I can't thank you enough for yesterday. Please call me Jake." He leaned against the barn door, watching as she worked the brush in gentle circles. "How are they doing?" Elena's smile faded slightly. "Scout's fine, but Daisy's still weak. This drought—" She shook her head, setting down the brush. "The stream used to be their favorite spot, but it dried up a few weeks ago. I've been hauling water from town, but it's not sustainable." She led Jake outside, gesturing to her withering fields. "No, it's not just me. The Martinez family lost 3 cows last week. The Petersons' corn crop failed completely." Her voice cracked slightly. "We've had dry spells before, but nothing like this." Jake nodded, his brow furrowed. "Mind if I take a look up the stream? Maybe there's something we're missing." "Be my guest," Elena replied. "Just be careful. The banks are unstable in places." Jake followed the dried stream bed, noting how the once green vegetation had turned brown and brittle. The morning heat was already intense, and sweat dampened his shirt as he climbed over fallen branches and navigated around large cracks in the parched earth. A family of rabbits darted past him, looking thin and desperate. The further upstream he went, the more disturbing signs he found. In what remained of some deeper pools, dead fish lay scattered across the cracked mud. Jake knelt down to examine them. They hadn't been dead long, suggesting the water had disappeared suddenly rather than gradually drying up. After about an hour of hiking, Jake heard a low mechanical hum. Cresting a small hill, he stopped short at the sight before him. A massive concrete dam stretched across the stream bed, its gray surface stark against the natural landscape. Several large pipes extended from its base, snaking away toward what appeared to be an industrial complex in the distance. Before he could get a closer look, a sharp voice cut through the air. "This is private property!" 2 armed security guards emerged from a small station near the dam, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. "Turn around and leave immediately." Jake raised his hands slowly, showing he wasn't a threat. His mind raced, taking in every detail he could. The company logo on the guards' uniforms, the direction of the water pipes, the size of the dam. Without saying a word, he backed away carefully, maintaining eye contact with the guards until he was out of their sight. Back at the police station, Jake spread out maps and documents across his desk. His coffee grew cold as he dove deep into research about the mysterious dam. County records showed that Grayson Industries had obtained permits for what they called a temporary water management facility just 6 months ago. The paperwork looked legitimate at first glance, but something nagged at him. "Hey, Sarah," he called to the records clerk. "Did we get any community notices about this dam project?" Sarah shook her head. "First I'm hearing of it." Jake frowned, making notes. A project this size should have required public hearings and environmental impact studies. He found nothing. That afternoon, he drove out to visit Tom Miller, whose farm lay closest to the dam. The old farmer sat with Jake on his front porch, his weathered face creased with worry. "My well's been dry for 2 weeks now," Tom said, pointing to his withered cornfield. "Never happened before in 40 years of farming here. But that ain't the strangest part." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Been seeing trucks up there at night? Big ones carrying these weird blue barrels. They're mighty careful with them, too, like they're handling something dangerous." Jake's pen moved quickly across his notepad. "How often do you see these trucks?" "Every couple nights, always after midnight." Tom shook his head. "Something ain't right up there, Officer Warren." After speaking with 3 more farmers who shared similar stories, Jake drove to Elena's ranch. He found her in the garden, trying to save what remained of her tomato plants. "Elena, I need to show you something," Jake said, pulling out the permit documents. They sat at her kitchen table, papers spread out between them. Elena's hands trembled as she read through them. "This is impossible," she whispered. "That dam wasn't there last year. Look." She hurried to a cabinet and pulled out a photo album. Inside was a picture dated just 8 months ago. The stream running full and clear, wildflowers dotting its banks. "This is what they've destroyed." Jake studied the photo carefully. "The permits say it's temporary, but those concrete structures I saw look permanent." "Temporary? Elena's voice rose with anger. "My horses nearly died. Our farms are dying. And for what?" "I need to get closer to that dam," Jake said, his voice firm. "Get some pictures, document what's really going on up there. But those guards—" "You'll need to go at night," Elena said. She hesitated, then added, "I know every inch of that land." "I could help you." Jake considered this. The dam needed to be investigated, but he'd have to be careful. One wrong move could alert Grayson Industries and destroy any chance of uncovering the truth. "I'll go tonight," he decided. "But I need you to stay here, Elena. It's safer that way." The moon cast long shadows across the landscape as Jake parked his truck behind a thick cluster of trees. He double-checked his equipment, flashlight, camera, and a small notebook tucked into his jacket pocket. His heart pounded as he began the careful hike toward the dam, staying low and moving quietly through the brush. The night air felt heavy and still. Only the steady hum of industrial machinery broke the silence, growing louder as he approached the site. Jake crouched behind a large boulder, surveying the area. Security lights cast an artificial glow over the concrete structure, but large sections remained in shadow. Moving cautiously from one patch of darkness to another, Jake worked his way closer to the dam. His boots made no sound on the dry earth. Near the base of the structure, he discovered a fenced area partially hidden from view. What he saw made his blood run cold. Dozens of blue barrels lay half buried in the dirt, their warning labels clearly visible in the beam of his flashlight. Jake's camera clicked quietly as he documented everything. The labels showed skull and crossbones symbols, along with chemical warnings he'd never seen before. Following the massive pipes that emerged from the dam, Jake traced their path toward the mining site. The setup was elaborate, far more complex than any temporary water management system would require. Water that should have been flowing to farms and ranches was being diverted in huge quantities. Jake scribbled quick notes about the pipeline configuration and took more photos. The evidence was damning. This was organized theft on a massive scale, destroying the livelihood of every farmer and rancher downstream. Suddenly, a sharp beeping sound cut through the night. Jake's heart stopped as floodlights blazed to life, bathing the entire area in harsh white light. He'd triggered a motion sensor. "Hey, over there!" a guard's voice shouted. Jake dropped to the ground as flashlight beams swept the area. Heavy boots pounded on metal walkways above him. He rolled under the cover of some equipment, then sprinted for the tree line. "Stop! Security!" Jake crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at his face. He could hear the guards pursuing him, their lights dancing through the trees. His lungs burned as he ran, taking a zigzag path through the forest. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Jake reached his truck. His hand shook as he started the engine and carefully drove away, keeping his lights off until he was well clear of the area. When he finally pulled over on a quiet stretch of road, Jake realized he was drenched in sweat. The situation was far worse than he'd imagined. The scale of the operation, the buried chemicals, the water theft, none of this could have happened without help from someone in local government, someone with the power to approve permits and look the other way. The morning sun filtered through Elena's kitchen window as Jake spread the photos across her wooden table. His hand still trembled slightly from the previous night's close call. Elena leaned in, her dark eyes widening as she examined each image. "These chemicals," she pointed to the warning labels on the barrels. "This isn't just about stealing water. They're doing something much worse." Jake nodded, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "The pipes are massive, Elena. They're taking enough water to supply several towns, all going straight to Grayson Industries. And those barrels, I've never seen warning labels like that before." Elena sank into a chair, her shoulders heavy with worry. "No wonder my horses were so desperate yesterday. The water that's left probably isn't even safe. Later that morning, they walked together through the local farmers market. The usual cheerful atmosphere was missing, replaced by a somber mood that matched the parched landscape. Withered produce lay on display tables, telling the story of failing crops and desperate times. "My corn's barely knee-high," Bill Henderson, a longtime farmer, told Jake as he gestured to his meager display. "Government folks promised help weeks ago. Water assistance, emergency funds. Haven't seen a drop or a dime." At the next stall, Tom Martinez wiped sweat from his forehead. 20 years I've worked this land. Now." He shook his head. "Got an offer from some development company yesterday. Might have to take it. Can't keep watching everything die." Jake listened to story after story, each one painting a clearer picture of the community's struggle. Elena stayed close, occasionally squeezing his arm when a particularly heart-wrenching tale emerged. As they were preparing to leave, Councilman Richards appeared beside Jake's truck. His expensive suit looked out of place among the dusty pickup trucks and work clothes. "Officer Warren," Richards said quietly, glancing around. "Word is you've been asking questions about the new water management system." Jake kept his face neutral. "Just doing my job, sir." Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Things are more complicated than they appear. For everyone's sake, I suggest you focus on regular police work." His tone was friendly, but his eyes were cold. Some situations are better left alone. Without waiting for a response, Richards turned and walked away, leaving Jake with a growing knot in his stomach. The warning only confirmed what he'd suspected. The corruption reached into the local government, perhaps even higher. Jake sat at a cramped desk in the county records office, surrounded by stacks of dusty files and folders. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he carefully examined each document related to the dam's construction. His eyes burned from hours of reading fine print, but determination kept him going. "This can't be right," he muttered, comparing two permits side by side. The signatures on the environmental clearances didn't match across documents. Some pages were clearly photocopied from others, with dates awkwardly changed. Most troubling of all, the required environmental impact assessments were completely missing from the files. By early afternoon, Jake had filled several pages of his notebook with discrepancies. He rubbed his tired eyes and gathered his findings, heading straight to City Hall. Mayor Hensley's office was cool and pristine, a stark contrast to the drought-stricken town outside. The mayor sat behind his massive oak desk, his usual friendly smile not quite reaching his eyes. "What can I do for you, Officer Warren?" Hensley asked, gesturing for Jake to sit. "I've been reviewing the dam construction permits, sir," Jake said, keeping his voice steady. "There seem to be some irregularities in the paperwork." The mayor waved his hand dismissively. "Everything was done by the book, Jake. We had our best people handle all the legal requirements. But the environmental impact assessments were all properly filed," Hensley cut in. "Listen, son, I know you're doing your job, but this project is bringing jobs to our community. Let's not create problems where none exist." As the mayor spoke, Jake's eyes wandered to a large framed photo on the wall. It showed Hensley smiling broadly, shaking hands with a well-dressed man in front of the Grayson Industries logo. The photo appeared recent, contradicting the mayor's claims of minimal involvement with the company. Back home that evening, Jake spread his findings across his kitchen table. Photos from the dam site, copies of the irregular permits, and his detailed notes painted a clear picture of corruption. He pulled up the state environmental agency's contact information on his laptop, ready to report his findings. Suddenly, his house plunged into darkness. The laptop screen provided the only light in the room. Jake walked to his window and peered out. A black sedan was parked across the street, its headlights off. When Jake stepped onto his porch for a better look, the car's engine roared to life, and it sped away into the night, leaving Jake standing alone in the darkness. The morning sun had barely risen when Jake submitted his anonymous report to the State Environmental Agency's website. His hands hovered over the keyboard as he carefully documented everything: the forged permits, the suspicious barrels, and the water theft that was destroying the community. He attached the damning photos, double-checking that they clearly showed the illegal water diversion and chemical storage. After sending the report, Jake drove to Elena's ranch. She was brushing Scout in the barn when he arrived, her movements gentle and practiced. "I filed the report," Jake said, leaning against the weathered barn door. Elena's hand still on the brush. "Be careful, Jake. Grayson Industries doesn't play fair. Last year they drove out a journalist who tried exposing their practices in another town. The poor man lost his job and had to move away." Jake nodded solemnly. "I'll watch my back." Throughout the day, Jake noticed subtle changes in town. At Miller's General Store, where he'd bought his coffee every morning for years, Sarah Miller suddenly claimed their coffee machine was broken. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Walking down Main Street, Jake saw Mrs. Peterson, his elderly neighbor, cross to the other side when she spotted him. Others whispered and pointed as he passed. Back at the station, his phone rang with an unlisted number. Jake answered, hearing heavy breathing on the other end. "You're making a big mistake," a distorted voice warned. "Leave well enough alone, or you'll regret it." The line went dead. By late afternoon, Jake had enough of the cold shoulders and threats. He drove back to Elena's ranch, finding comfort in the familiar sight of the old farmhouse and the sound of horses in the distance. Elena was in her study, surrounded by old environmental reports and testing equipment from her consulting days. Scout and Daisy grazed peacefully in the nearby paddock. "I need your help," Jake said, explaining his plan to collect water samples. "With your background in environmental consulting, you could help prove what they're doing." Elena studied the equipment on her desk. "We'll need to collect samples from multiple points along the stream bed, especially near those barrels." She pulled out collection vials and testing strips. "We can go tomorrow morning." As they discussed the details, Scout and Daisy wandered over to the study's open window. The horses pressed their soft noses against the screen, nickering softly. Elena reached out to stroke Scout's muzzle through the mesh, and Jake patted Daisy's neck. For a moment, the weight of their investigation lifted, replaced by the simple comfort of connection, both with the gentle animals and each other. The morning air was crisp as Jake and Elena made their way along the dried stream bed. Elena knelt beside a patch of discolored soil, her experienced eyes scanning the ground. She pulled on latex gloves and carefully scooped samples into labeled containers. "See these white deposits?" Elena pointed to crystalline formations along the cracked earth. "That's not natural mineral buildup. Something's contaminating the soil." Jake photographed everything: the white deposits, the collection sites, and Elena's methodical process. She worked with precise movements, marking locations on a map and taking detailed notes. "The pH levels are way off," Elena muttered, checking a testing strip. "These readings match what I've seen at industrial waste sites." They followed the stream's path closer to the dam, collecting more samples. Elena's face grew increasingly troubled with each test. "Jake, these chemicals, they're destroying the ecosystem. It could take years for the land to recover." On their drive back to the ranch, Jake noticed a black SUV appear in his rearview mirror. It stayed a few car lengths behind, matching their every turn. "We've got company," Jake said quietly, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Elena glanced back. "They're getting closer." The SUV suddenly accelerated, pulling alongside their truck. Its dark-tinted windows concealed the driver as it swerved toward them, trying to force them off the road. Jake's police training kicked in. He maintained control of the truck, carefully timing his braking and acceleration to prevent the SUV from making contact. Elena clutched the samples tightly as they took a sharp turn onto a narrow dirt road. "Hold on," Jake called out as he navigated the familiar back roads. The SUV struggled to keep up on the uneven terrain, eventually falling behind. They made it back to Elena's ranch, hearts pounding, but safe. That night, Jake was helping Elena analyze the samples when they heard Scout's panicked neighing. They rushed outside to see orange flames lighting up the darkness. The barn was on fire. "The horses!" Elena cried out, running toward the building. Jake ran with her, helping to guide Scout and Daisy to safety, while Elena called 911. They worked together with garden hoses and buckets until the fire department arrived. The flames consumed half the barn's hay storage and damaged much of Elena's equipment before they could extinguish it. As the last embers smoldered, Jake and Elena stood in the charred doorway, covered in soot and smoke. Scout and Daisy huddled nearby, still spooked from the ordeal. "This wasn't an accident," Elena said, her voice shaking as she surveyed the damage. Jake placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "We're not backing down. Not now, not ever. Whatever it takes, we're going to stop them." Elena nodded, reaching up to squeeze his hand. They watched in silence as the smoke drifted into the night sky, the threat of Grayson Industries' retaliation hanging heavy in the air. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Elena's kitchen as farmers and ranchers filed in, filling every available chair and leaning against walls. The room buzzed with whispered conversations and concerned looks. Jake stood at the front, spreading out photos and documents on the kitchen table. "This isn't just about a drought," Jake began, his voice steady. "The dam Grayson Industries built is stealing our water." He pointed to the photos he'd taken, showing the massive pipes and industrial equipment. Elena stepped forward, holding up soil samples in clear containers. "These chemicals are poisoning our land. As an environmental consultant, I can tell you these levels are dangerous." Some faces in the crowd darkened with anger, while others showed doubt. Tom Wilson, who owned the dairy farm down the road, shook his head. "That's a serious accusation, Jake. Grayson Industries brings jobs to town. Are you sure about this?" Before Jake could respond, Mr. Lyle, a retired school teacher with wispy white hair and wire-rimmed glasses, stood up slowly from his chair. He carried a worn leather photo album. "I've lived here 63 years, Mr. Lyle said, his voice quiet but firm. He opened the album, showing photographs of the stream from decades past. "This is what our land looked like before Grayson Industries came." The photo showed crystal-clear water flowing abundantly, children swimming in deep pools, and lush vegetation along the banks. Mr. Lyle passed the album around, and the room grew silent as people compared the historical images to their current reality. "My students used to study wildlife by that stream," Mr. Lyle continued. "There were fish, frogs, all sorts of birds. Now there's nothing but dry earth and dead plants." His words seemed to shift the mood in the room. Even Tom Wilson leaned forward, examining the photos with newfound interest. Sarah Martinez, whose family had farmed tomatoes for 3 generations, stood up. "My well ran dry last month. If what you're saying is true, we need to fight back." Heads nodded around the room. Elena pulled out a petition she'd prepared. "We're asking the state environmental agency to investigate. We need your signatures, and we need you to spread the word." People began lining up to sign, their earlier skepticism replaced with determination. Jake noticed through the window that an unfamiliar car was parked across the street, its occupant watching the house. As the group organized themselves into smaller committees, Jake pulled Elena aside. "Grayson Industries will try to stop this," he said quietly. Elena squared her shoulders. Then they'll have to stop all of us. The meeting continued as they established communication networks and planned their next steps. Through it all, the car remained outside, a silent reminder of the forces they were up against. The first rays of sunlight hadn't yet touched the horizon when Jake walked to his patrol car. He stopped short, his breath catching at the sight before him. All 4 tires were flat, angry slash marks visible in the rubber. Harsh red spray paint marked the car's side. "Stay out of it." Jake ran his hand through his hair, jaw tightening. After a few deep breaths, he pulled out his phone and called Bill Thompson, a local mechanic who'd signed the petition yesterday. "Need to borrow your truck, Bill. Had some trouble with my car." 20 minutes later, Jake pulled up to Elena's ranch in Bill's old blue pickup. Elena was already waiting outside, carefully labeled samples in a cooler. "Ready?" Jake asked as she climbed in. "More than ready. These samples will prove what they're doing." The drive to the state lab started peacefully enough. Elena kept checking the cooler, making sure nothing had spilled. They were about halfway back when Jake noticed a black SUV in his rearview mirror. "We've got company," he said quietly. Elena gripped the door handle as the SUV accelerated, pulling alongside them. The driver wore dark sunglasses, and the passenger window rolled down. "Hold on," Jake called out, spotting a side road ahead. He waited until the last second, then yanked the wheel right. The truck bounced onto the dirt road as the SUV shot past, unable to turn in time. "That should buy us some time," Jake said, taking a series of quick turns through back roads he knew well. When they finally reached Elena's ranch, Jake's heart sank. Her mailbox lay crumpled on the ground, looking like it had been hit with a baseball bat. Elena rushed forward and reached inside, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. Her hands shook as she read the note aloud. "This is your last warning." From the barn, Scout and Daisy began whinnying loudly, picking up on the tension. Elena walked over to comfort them while Jake paced, phone in hand. "I'm calling the state police," he said firmly. "This has gone too far. We need protection while we wait for those lab results." Elena nodded, stroking Scout's nose as the horse nudged her anxiously. "They're scared," she said. "Not just the horses. Whoever's behind this is scared of what we'll find." Jake dialed the state police, watching Elena with the horses as he waited for someone to answer. The threats were escalating, but so was their resolve. Jake stood in Sheriff Roberts' office, watching the older man shift uncomfortably behind his desk. The morning sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds, creating bars of light across the worn carpet. "You can't keep ignoring this, Sheriff," Jake said, placing photos of the slashed tires and threatening note on the desk. "People are being intimidated. Someone could get hurt." Sheriff Roberts rubbed his weathered face, the circles under his eyes dark with exhaustion. "What do you expect me to do, Jake? My hands are tied." "Your hands are tied? Or someone's tying them?" The sheriff's shoulders slumped. He glanced at the door, then lowered his voice. "Mayor Hensley, he made it clear. Look the other way or lose the badge." He let out a shaky breath. "I've got 3 years till retirement, Jake. A sick wife to think about." Jake leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "People's livelihoods are at stake. Their water, their land, everything they've worked for." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small notebook. "I've been keeping track. Meetings, dates, names." His hands trembled slightly as he slid it across the desk. "Grayson Industries executives meet with local officials every Tuesday night at the old hunting lodge outside town. Off the books." Jake flipped through the pages, his eyes widening. "This is months of records." "There's more," the sheriff said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Last month, I overheard 2 Grayson supervisors talking about waste disposal. They've been dumping hazardous materials to save money. Those barrels you found, that's just the tip of the iceberg." Jake's stomach churned as he thought of the contaminated water samples. "Why didn't you report this?" "You don't understand the reach these people have," the sheriff replied, fear evident in his eyes. "One word from me and my pension disappears. My wife loses her medical coverage." Jake tucked the notebook carefully into his jacket. He needed to share this with Elena, but they'd have to be smart about how they use the information. The sheriff's career, maybe even his life, could depend on their discretion. "Thank you," Jake said quietly. "We'll be careful with this." Later that afternoon, Jake met Elena in her kitchen, well away from windows. He showed her the notebook, watching her face as she read through the detailed accounts. "This changes everything," Elena whispered. "But we can't reveal where it came from. The sheriff—" "Would be finished," Jake finished. "We need to protect our allies. Find another way to verify these meetings without exposing him." Elena nodded, her expression determined but cautious. "We'll need to be smarter than ever. No more direct confrontations. No more solo investigations." "Agreed," Jake said. "We work together, stay careful, keep the sheriff's name out of it completely." Jake's phone buzzed as he sat at his desk reviewing the sheriff's notebook. The caller ID showed the State Environmental Agency. "Officer Warren? This is Dr. Martinez from the Environmental Protection Division. We've completed the analysis of your samples." The scientist's voice was grave. "The contamination levels are off the charts. We found toxic metals, industrial solvents, and chemical waste that exceed legal limits by more than 10 times. Jake's hand tightened around the phone. "Can you send me the official report?" "Already on its way to your email. This is serious, Officer Warren. These toxins could poison groundwater for years to come." After hanging up, Jake immediately called Elena to share the news. Finally, they had concrete proof of Grayson Industries' illegal dumping. But their victory was short-lived. When Jake returned home that evening, his front door stood slightly ajar. His stomach dropped as he pushed it open, hand instinctively moving to his service weapon. The house was ransacked. Drawers hung open, papers scattered across the floor. But the thieves had a clear target. His laptop lay smashed on the kitchen table, the screen shattered beyond repair. The external hard drive containing his photo backups was missing, along with his files and notebooks. Jake's hand shook as he called Elena. "They got everything," he said, his voice tight. "All the photos from the dam, the documentation, everything." "Come to the ranch," Elena said without hesitation. "We'll figure this out together." An hour later, they sat at Elena's kitchen table, surrounded by blank note paper and cups of strong coffee. Scout and Daisy lingered near the open window, their gentle nickering a soothing backdrop to their urgent work. "We still have the soil samples," Elena reminded him, reaching for a fresh notepad. "And the lab results. They couldn't steal those." Jake rubbed his tired eyes. "We need to recreate everything before the council meeting. All the evidence, all the connections." "Then that's what we'll do," Elena said firmly. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Remember when you found Daisy in that mud? You didn't give up then, even when it seemed impossible." Jake looked over at the horses, remembering that sweltering afternoon that now felt like a lifetime ago. Scout met his gaze, those same intelligent eyes that had led him to her trapped foal. Back then, he thought he was just helping a distressed animal. Now he was fighting for an entire community. "You're right," he said, straightening in his chair. "Let's get to work. We got all night." They spread their remaining documents across the table, ready to rebuild their case from scratch. The horses kept their quiet vigil, a reminder of why this fight mattered so much. Jake and Elena arrived at the town hall an hour before the council meeting, their arms laden with folders containing their meticulously recreated evidence. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the documents on the podium. "We've got this," Jake reassured her, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze. People began filing in, their faces etched with worry and anticipation. Farmers in dusty work boots sat next to ranchers in weathered hats. The wooden benches creaked under their weight as more townspeople crowded in until there wasn't an empty seat left. Mayor Hensley called the meeting to order, his usual smooth demeanor showing signs of strain. Jake stepped up to the podium, his heart pounding, but his voice steady as he began his presentation. "What you're about to see proves that our water crisis isn't natural," Jake said, clicking through his photos. "This dam was built without proper permits or environmental assessments." He pointed to the forged documents explaining each discrepancy in simple terms. Gas filled the room as Jake showed pictures of the buried barrels and diverted water pipes. When he held up the state lab's toxicology report, the crowd's murmurs grew louder. "These chemicals are poisoning our land," he explained, his voice carrying across the packed room. "The same land that's been in your families for generations." The room erupted into angry shouts. "They're killing our livestock," one farmer yelled. "My well's been dry for months," called another. Mayor Hensley raised his hands for silence. Now, he said, his voice oily smooth. "These accusations are completely unfounded. Grayson Industries has all the proper permits." "Permits you helped falsify," someone shouted from the back. Just then, the double doors swung open. 2 men in expensive suits strode in, followed by 3 others carrying leather briefcases. The room fell silent. "I'm Richard Grayson," the taller man announced, "and these allegations are completely false." He gestured to his lawyers. "We have documentation proving every aspect of our operation is legal." "What about the toxic chemicals?" Elena stood up, her voice strong despite her shaking hands. "I'm an environmental consultant, and those test results don't lie." "Officer Warren's evidence was obtained illegally," one of the lawyers cut in, "and Ms. Morales is hardly an unbiased source given her financial difficulties." Jake felt his face flush with anger, but before he could respond, Mr. Lyle, the retired schoolteacher, stood up. "I've lived here 60 years, he declared. "I've watched that stream dry up since they came. I'm standing with Jake." "So am I," another voice called out, then another and another, until the room was filled with people rising to their feet, voices joining together in support. The mayor banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but the tide had turned. Jake looked around at the determined faces of his neighbors, feeling a surge of hope despite the council's inaction. The truth was finally out, and the community was ready to fight. The morning after the council meeting, Jake and Elena sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by poster boards and markers. Scout and Daisy grazed peacefully in the nearby paddock as they worked on their protest plans. "We need to keep this peaceful," Jake said, sketching out a layout for the protest area. "That's crucial." Elena nodded, writing, "Save our water" in bold letters on a sign. "I've already got 15 signatures on the petition from just this morning. People are angry, but they're ready to stand up the right way." Over the next few days, their coalition grew steadily. Mr. Lyle offered his barn as a meeting space where farmers and ranchers gathered to share stories and make protest signs. Local business owners donated supplies, and even the usually quiet shop owners began speaking out. "My grandfather built this store 60 years ago," said Martha from the hardware store. She signed the petition. "I won't let them destroy our town." By Friday morning, the protest was ready. Jake had mapped out safe zones and coordinated with sympathetic officers to ensure everyone's protection. Elena had organized carpools and water stations for the protesters. The summer sun beat down as people began gathering near the dam. Children held hand-painted signs reading "Save Our Farms," while their parents carried larger banners about water rights. The crowd grew to nearly 100 people, their voices joining in unified chants. What do we want? Clean water. When do we want it? Now! Jake watched from the edge of the crowd, his police radio ready in case of trouble. Elena moved through the protesters, helping organize their positions and keeping spirits high. The atmosphere changed when 3 black SUVs pulled up. Security guards in dark uniforms stepped out, their faces stern as they formed a line between the protesters and the dam. "This is private property," one guard announced through a megaphone. "You need to disperse immediately." The protesters stood their ground, continuing their peaceful chants. Mr. Lyle led a group in singing, "This land is your land," their voices steady despite the guards' intimidating presence. Sarah Chen, a reporter from the local newspaper, moved through the crowd taking photos and interviewing protesters. As she worked her way toward the dam's perimeter, her camera caught something in the background. Partially exposed barrels poking through recently disturbed soil. Moving closer, Sarah photographed the warning labels clearly visible on the rusted containers. Her hand shook as she uploaded the images to social media, adding detailed descriptions of the location and context. Within hours, the photos began spreading across the internet. State news outlets picked up the story, sharing Sarah's images alongside aerial views of the dam and the dried-up stream. Water justice started trending in their state, bringing the spotlight directly onto Grayson Industries' activities. The security guard shifted uncomfortably as more reporters began arriving. Their cameras focused on both the peaceful protesters and the damning evidence of environmental violations now exposed behind them. The morning sun had barely risen when Jake discovered the damage to his borrowed truck. Deep scratches marred the blue paint, spelling out, "Leave now or else," across the driver's side door. His stomach tightened as he ran his fingers along the gouges, knowing this wasn't just teenage vandalism. His phone rang. It was Elena, her voice shaking. "Jake, I just got a call. They said if I don't stop helping you, something terrible would happen to the ranch." She paused, trying to steady her breathing. "They knew things, Jake. Private things about my daily routine." "Stay where you are. I'm coming over," Jake said, already heading to his patrol car. When Jake arrived at Elena's ranch, he found her pacing on the front porch, her face pale with worry. Scout and Daisy watched from their paddock, sensing the tension in the air. As evening settled in, the attack came swift and brutal. The crack of breaking glass shattered the quiet night, followed by the whoosh of flames. 3 masked figures had thrown Molotov cocktails into Elena's equipment shed. The fire spread quickly, engulfing years' worth of farming equipment in minutes. Scout's frightened whinnying pierced the air as smoke billowed across the paddock. Daisy pressed against her mother, trembling. Jake and Elena worked frantically with garden hoses until the fire department arrived, but the shed was already destroyed. "You can't stay here," Jake said firmly, watching the firefighters douse the last of the flames. "They're escalating. Next time could be worse." Elena nodded, tears in her eyes as she stroked Scout's neck. "But where can we go?" "I know a place," Jake assured her. "My aunt has a small farm 2 counties over. You and the horses will be safe there until we sort this out." They worked quickly in the darkness, loading Scout and Daisy into Elena's horse trailer. Jake helped Elena pack essential items, both of them jumping at every sound in the night. The next morning, Jake sat in his office, frustration evident in his clenched jaw as he spoke on the phone with the state police. "Unless you have concrete evidence linking these attacks to Grayson Industries, there's not much we can do," the state police sergeant explained. security footage, witnesses willing to testify, something solid. The environmental agency offered similar responses. We're investigating the toxic waste claims, but connecting the company to these attacks requires proof we don't have yet. Jake slammed down the phone, running his hands through his hair. The law was supposed to protect people like Elena, not leave them vulnerable to corporate bullies. He pulled out his notebook, starting a new page of investigation notes. They might have forced Elena into hiding, but he wasn't about to let them win. Jake's cell phone buzzed as he was reviewing his case notes. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen. "Officer Warren speaking," he answered, his voice weary from the long day. I work for Grayson Industries," a shaky male voice whispered. "I have information you need to see. About the dam, the chemicals, everything." Jake sat up straighter, his heart racing. "How do I know this isn't a trap?" "Because I helped design the dam," the man said. "And I can't live with what they're doing anymore. Please, we need to meet somewhere private." They arranged to meet at midnight in an old barn 3 miles outside town. Jake arrived early, parking his truck behind some trees and scanning the area for any signs of surveillance. The sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of a small sedan. A young man in khakis and a wrinkled dress shirt stepped out, clutching a thick manila envelope to his chest. His glasses caught the moonlight as he glanced nervously over his shoulder. "I'm Eric," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm an environmental engineer at Grayson." His hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside the barn, Eric spread documents across a weathered workbench. "These are the original dam blueprints," he explained, pointing to technical drawings. "See these modifications? They were made specifically to divert water illegally." Jake studied the papers under his flashlight. "And these invoices?" "For the chemical barrels. They're cutting corners on waste disposal." Eric pulled out a stack of printed emails. "But this is what you really need. Correspondence between our executives and town officials. Proof of bribes, cover-ups, everything." Jake's hand shook as he read through the emails. Names, dates, dollar amounts. It was all there in black and white. The evidence he'd been searching for. "Why are you doing this?" Jake asked, looking at the nervous engineer. Eric pushed his glasses up his nose. "Because I became an engineer to help people, not poison them. I can't sleep at night knowing what we're doing to this town." "This is exactly what we need," Jake said, carefully organizing the documents. "You're very brave to come forward." "Just be careful," Eric warned, glancing toward the door. "These people, they'll do anything to protect themselves. They have private security, connections with local gangs. They won't hesitate to use force." Jake nodded solemnly. "I'll protect your identity. No one will know where this came from." "Good luck," Eric said, hurrying back to his car. "You're going to need it." The morning sun filtered through the windows of Elena's living room as members of their coalition gathered around her large oak dining table. Jake spread out the documents from Eric while Elena poured coffee for everyone. Local newspaper editor Sarah Chen leaned forward, her eyes widening as she examined the blueprints. Farmer Mike Rodriguez shook his head in disgust at the toxic waste records. "This is incredible," Sarah said, scribbling notes furiously. "These emails prove direct payoffs to the mayor and council members." Elena pointed to the chemical analysis reports. "Look at these toxicity levels. They're dumping industrial waste that's 10 times over the legal limit. And here's proof they deliberately designed the dam to steal our water," Mike added, his weathered hands tracing the modified blueprints. "No wonder our wells are running dry." Jake stood at the head of the table, his voice firm. "We need to move fast. Grayson Industries already knows we have something. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes." The group nodded in agreement. Sarah pulled out her laptop. I'll start writing the expose immediately. We'll need to coordinate with state media outlets too. Make sure this story can't be buried. Back at his office, Jake carefully organized everything into a comprehensive report. He included Eric's documents, the state lab's toxicology results, and his photos from the dam site. He made multiple copies, knowing they couldn't risk losing any evidence. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he wrote a detailed cover letter to the state environmental agency. "This has to be perfect," he muttered, double-checking every detail. After 3 hours of meticulous work, Jake finally hit send on the email to the state agency. He then shipped sealed copies to 5 different news outlets via overnight delivery. The sun was setting when Jake pulled into his driveway. A black SUV with tinted windows idled across the street, its engine running. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his service weapon as he watched the vehicle in his rearview mirror. The crash of breaking glass shattered the evening quiet. Jake ducked instinctively as a rock sailed through his front window, landing on his living room floor. Attached to it was a note, the threatening message scrawled in red ink, "Stop now or else." With practiced calm, Jake called the state police while checking all his doors and windows. He moved methodically through his house, securing entry points and drawing blinds. The black SUV remained outside, a silent warning in the growing darkness. "This is Officer Warren," he said into his phone. "I need to report an act of intimidation and vandalism." He described the situation, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. As he spoke, Jake positioned himself away from windows, his back against a solid wall. The state police promised to send a patrol car, but Jake knew it would take them at least an hour to reach his remote location. He settled in for a long night, his resolve stronger than ever. These threats only proved how desperate Grayson Industries had become, and how close he was to exposing their crimes. The morning air buzzed with anticipation as 3 state environmental investigators pulled up to the dam site in their official vehicles. Jake and Elena stood waiting, watching as the team unloaded their testing equipment and sampling kits. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Officer Warren," said lead investigator Martinez, a stern-faced woman in her 50s. "These allegations are extremely serious." The team began their inspection, methodically documenting everything with cameras and notepads. Elena pointed out areas where she'd noticed soil discoloration, her environmental expertise proving invaluable. "Over here," Jake called out, leading them to a partially concealed area behind some brush. The investigators began digging, soon uncovering row after row of rusted barrels. "This is worse than we thought," Martinez said, examining the warning labels. "These containers are clearly not meant for ground storage. The chemicals could be leaching into the groundwater." As the team worked, Ellen noticed something peculiar in the soil pattern. "Look at this depression," she said, pointing to a subtle dip in the ground. The investigators brought in ground-penetrating radar equipment, revealing dozens more barrels buried deeper underground. "My God!" Martinez muttered, shaking her head. "This is a full-scale illegal dump site." The investigation was interrupted by the arrival of 3 Grayson Industries security vehicles. Guards jumped out, rushing toward the group with angry shouts. "This is private property," the head of security yelled. "You need to leave immediately." Martinez stood her ground, holding up her state credentials. "This is now an official state investigation. Any interference will result in criminal charges." The guards formed a line, trying to block access to an area near the water diversion pipes. Jake stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. "I suggest you step aside," he said calmly. "You don't want to add obstruction of a state investigation to the company's problems." The guards shifted uncomfortably, looking to their leader for direction. After a tense moment, they backed down, though their faces remained tight with anger. The investigators continued their work, taking soil samples, photographing the barrels, and documenting the water diversion system. They discovered pipes leading directly from the toxic storage area to the stream bed, explaining the contamination levels in the water samples. "This is clear evidence of willful environmental violations," Martinez announced as her team packed up their equipment. "We'll be filing our initial report today and requesting an emergency shutdown of this facility." She turned to Jake and Elena. "You did the right thing bringing this to us. We'll make sure this gets handled properly through official channels." Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he watched the investigators drive away. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel hopeful. Elena squeezed his arm gently, sharing in his relief, though they both knew their fight wasn't over yet. Jake sat in his office, staring at the phone after his conversation with investigator Martinez. Her words echoed in his mind. Someone on the town council had tipped off Grayson Industries about the investigation, giving them time to destroy evidence at their other sites. "It had to be the mayor," Jake muttered, remembering Walter Hensley's suspicious behavior and that photo of him with Grayson's CEO. But suspicion wasn't enough. He needed proof. Later that evening, at the emergency community meeting in the town hall, the room was packed with concerned citizens. Jake stood at the podium, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "Someone in our local government betrayed this community," he said, his eyes fixed on Mayor Hensley. "They warned Grayson Industries about the investigation, helping them cover up their crimes." The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "That's a serious accusation, Officer Warren. Do you have any proof?" "Why don't you tell us about your private meetings with Grayson executives, Mr. Mayor?" Jake pressed. "About the deals made behind closed doors?" Hensley's face reddened. "I meet with many business leaders. That's part of my job." Sarah Chen, a local journalist, stood up from her seat. "Actually, I have something relevant to share." She pulled out her phone and pressed play. The mayor's voice filled the room. "Once the permits are approved, the usual payment will be transferred to your offshore account," Hensley's recorded voice said. "Just make sure those environmental reports stay buried." The room erupted in angry shouts. "Traitor!" someone yelled. "You sold us out!" Mayor Hensley jumped to his feet, his face now pale. "That recording is taken out of context," he sputtered. "This is a setup." But the damage was done. The other council members exchanged worried glances as the mayor stormed toward the exit, pushing past the crowd. "I move for an immediate vote to remove Mayor Hensley from office," announced Councilwoman Peterson, rising from her seat. The motion was quickly seconded. The vote was unanimous. As state police officers entered the hall to begin their investigation, Jake watched the former mayor's retreating figure through the window. The tide was finally turning in their favor, but there was still work to be done. Jake stared at the thick stack of legal documents on his desk, his heart heavy, but his resolve unwavering. Grayson Industries had filed a $5 million defamation lawsuit against him, claiming he had spread malicious lies about their operations. "They're trying to bankrupt you into silence," Elena said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. But the community refused to let Jake fight alone. Within days, farmers, ranchers, and townspeople organized fundraisers for his legal defense. They set up a booth at the weekly market, held bake sales, and even auctioned handmade quilts. Outside Grayson's local offices, dozens gathered daily, with signs reading "Stand with Jake" and "Water is Life." "We won't let them bully you," Mr. Lyle said, handing Jake an envelope full of cash collected from retired teachers. "You stood up for us. Now we stand up for you." The lawsuit, however, had an unexpected effect. Instead of silencing the investigation, it drew more attention to Grayson's activities. Regional newspapers picked up the story, and investigative reporters began digging deeper into the company's history. Then came the breakthrough. Amanda Torres, a junior attorney from Grayson's legal department, contacted Jake's lawyer. She had been keeping copies of internal memos and emails that proved the company's executives had known about the illegal dam construction and toxic dumping for months. "Look at this," Jake said to Elena, spreading the documents across her kitchen table. The memos detailed how executives had discussed the environmental violations in private meetings, choosing to hide the evidence rather than fix the problems. "They knew," Elena whispered, her eyes scanning the damning evidence. "They knew exactly what they were doing to our land." The story exploded across state news outlets. Grayson Industries' stock price plummeted as shareholders demanded answers. Within days, the company's board of directors called an emergency meeting. That evening, Jake and Elena watched the news together as Grayson's CEO, Richard Maxwell, announced his immediate resignation. The company also withdrew their lawsuit against Jake, issuing a brief statement about pursuing alternative solutions to the water crisis. Elena's kitchen erupted in cheers. Scout and Daisy, hearing the commotion from their stable, whinnied in response. Jake smiled, remembering how this all started with a trapped foal in a dried-up stream bed. "We did it," Elena said, hugging him tightly. "Part of it," Jake replied, glancing out the window at the still-standing dam in the distance. "But we're not done until that dam comes down and our stream flows again." The morning sun cast long shadows across the dam site as heavy machinery rumbled into position. State inspectors in yellow vests consulted blueprints while environmental crews in hazmat suits carefully began removing the toxic barrels. Jake stood with Elena and dozens of townspeople behind the safety barrier, watching history unfold. "Never thought I'd see this day," Mr. Lyle said, wiping tears from his eyes. Other farmers nodded in agreement, their faces showing years of worry beginning to lift. The first section of the dam came down with a thunderous crack. Workers methodically removed concrete blocks and metal supports, taking care not to disturb the contaminated soil around the structure. Special containers arrived to safely transport the toxic barrels to a proper disposal facility. By mid-afternoon, a small gap appeared in the dam's center. A trickle of water pushed through, growing stronger with each passing minute. The crowd broke into spontaneous applause as the stream began to reclaim its natural path. "Look!" Elena pointed to where the water was already filling the parched stream bed. The sound of running water, absent for so long, brought smiles to everyone's faces. Within hours, the trickle became a steady flow. Birds appeared, circling and landing near the fresh water. A family of deer emerged from the tree line, cautiously approaching the stream. Even the dry soil seemed to come alive, eagerly absorbing the moisture it had been denied for so long. Jake and Elena walked along the bank, watching the transformation. Scout and Daisy followed close behind, their hooves leaving prints in the newly dampened earth. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, reflecting off the flowing water. The horses approached the stream's edge, their ears perked forward with interest. Scout dipped his head first, taking a long drink from the clear water. Daisy joined him, no longer having to rely on trucked-in water for survival. Elena squeezed Jake's hand as they watched the horses drink. "I almost lost everything," she said softly. "The ranch, the horses, my home." Jake nodded, remembering the threats, the fires, and the intimidation they'd faced. "We all came close to losing what matters most," he replied, watching the stream continue its steady flow back to life. The county courthouse buzzed with activity as journalists and townspeople packed the benches. Jake sat quietly in the witness stand, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He spoke clearly and confidently, describing how he'd first discovered the illegal dam while following Scout to rescue Daisy. "The evidence was there all along," Jake explained, gesturing to the photos displayed on a large screen. "The dried-up stream, the toxic barrels, the forged permits, it all pointed to a deliberate effort to steal water and dump hazardous waste." The prosecutors methodically presented Jake's documentation, including the night photos he'd taken at great personal risk. Former Mayor Hensley shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Jake described the threatening messages, vandalism, and fires meant to silence him and Elena. Eric took the stand next, his hands trembling slightly as he faced his former employers. Despite his obvious nervousness, his voice grew stronger as he detailed the company's illegal operations. They knew the dam was destroying the community, Eric testified, pointing to internal emails projected on the screen. But profit was more important to them than people's lives or the environment. Other whistleblowers followed, each adding another piece to the puzzle. They described late-night barrel deliveries, doctored water quality reports, and explicit instructions to threaten anyone who asked too many questions. Their combined testimony painted a damning picture of corporate greed and corruption. The jury took just 3 days to reach their verdict. As the forewoman stood to read it, Jake felt Elena squeeze his hand. The courtroom fell silent. "We find the defendants guilty on all counts," the forewoman announced. The judge imposed maximum sentences on the former executives who had orchestrated the scheme. Mayor Hensley and other officials received jail time for accepting bribes and endangering public safety. Grayson Industries was ordered to pay millions in fines and restoration costs. As Jake stood to leave, the entire courtroom rose with him. The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous ovation. Jake ducked his head, embarrassed by the attention. "This wasn't about one person," he said when the clapping finally died down. "This was about a community that refused to be bullied or bought. We all stood together, and that's why we won." The spring sun warmed the earth as volunteers gathered along the restored streambed. Armed with shovels, saplings, and determination, they worked together to heal the land that had suffered under Grayson Industries' abuse. Elena directed a group of local ranchers, showing them how to properly plant young trees that would help prevent erosion. "The roots will hold the soil in place," she explained, demonstrating the correct depth for planting. "And once they're established, they'll provide shade for the stream." Jake helped clear debris from the former dam site, working alongside teenagers from the local high school. They filled bags with broken concrete and twisted metal, careful to separate recyclable materials from waste. The sound of running water provided a peaceful backdrop to their efforts. At Elena's ranch, the transformation was equally dramatic. The burned buildings had been rebuilt, with the community pitching in to raise new barns and repair fencing. Scout and Daisy grazed contentedly in a pasture that was slowly returning to its former green glory. Other horses rescued from drought-stricken farms found sanctuary there as well. Jake spent his afternoons coordinating with state environmental officials, helping them establish an early warning system for water quality issues. They installed monitoring stations along the stream and trained local volunteers to collect regular samples. "Prevention is our best defense," Jake told a group gathered in the community center. The workshop drew farmers and ranchers from across the county, eager to learn from past mistakes. Elena shared her expertise on sustainable water management, teaching techniques she'd learned during her environmental consulting days. As the sun began to set, families gathered by the stream for a long-awaited celebration. Tables loaded with potluck dishes lined the banks, and children splashed in the shallow water. The sound of laughter mixed with music from a local band. Jake stood with Elena near Scout, watching the scene unfold. The horse nickered softly, nudging Elena's shoulder as they observed kids tossing paper boats into the current. Downstream, a family of deer emerged from the tree line to drink, no longer afraid to approach the water. "Look at that," Elena said softly, pointing to a group of swallows diving and swooping over the stream. "They're catching insects again. The ecosystem is coming back." The celebration marked more than just environmental recovery. It represented a community that had found its voice and strength. People who had once been strangers now greeted each other like family, sharing stories of their part in the fight against corruption.
Oh.
Near the water's edge, Mr. Lyle, the retired school teacher, had set up a display of before and after photographs. Children gathered around him as he pointed out the differences, teaching them about the importance of protecting their natural resources. The autumn breeze rustled through the changing leaves as Jake's truck rolled up the gravel driveway to Elena's ranch. The transformation from just a few months ago was remarkable. Where there had once been scorched earth and damaged buildings, now stood a thriving community center with new stables and a small outdoor classroom. Scout's head popped over the fence as Jake parked, the horse immediately recognizing the familiar vehicle. Daisy, now fully grown, trotted alongside her mother, their coats gleaming with health in the morning sun. Children's laughter echoed from the paddock, where Elena was teaching a riding lesson to a group of eager students. "Officer Jake," several kids called out, waving from atop their ponies. Elena smiled warmly and walked over to greet him, her boots crunching on the gravel. "Just in time to see our new program in action," she said, gesturing to the young riders. "We're combining riding lessons with environmental education. The kids are learning about watershed protection today." Jake watched as volunteers led another group of children toward the stream, where they were setting up water testing equipment. Educational posters about local wildlife and conservation lined the walls of the new barn, and a small greenhouse stood nearby, filled with native plants ready for restoration projects. Standing by the fence, Jake's mind drifted back to that sweltering afternoon when he'd first encountered Scout on the dusty road. The desperate horse had led him to her trapped foal, setting in motion events that would change the entire community. He remembered the fear in Scout's eyes, the determination that had driven both him and Elena to fight for justice, and the countless challenges they'd faced together. "Sometimes I think about that day," Elena said softly, seeming to read his thoughts. "If Scout hadn't found you, if you hadn't been willing to listen and investigate." She trailed off, watching her horses graze peacefully in the distance. "We make a good team," Jake replied, thinking of all the late nights spent gathering evidence, the shared determination to protect their community, and the strength they'd found in supporting each other through the darkest moments. Elena nodded, her eyes bright with emotion. "More than that, we showed everyone that standing up for what's right is worth the risk. That one person really can make a difference." As Jake prepared to leave, he paused by his truck, taking in the scene before him. Scout and Daisy had moved to the pasture near the restored stream, their movements free and graceful. The once silent waterway now bubbled with life, its banks green with new growth. The horses galloped playfully along the water's edge, their joyful whinnies carrying across the ranch. The sound was so different from Scout's distressed cries that had first caught his attention. Now those cries of desperation had been replaced by expressions of pure joy, a testament to how far they'd come. Jake smiled as he watched the horses run, their happiness a perfect symbol of the healing that had taken place, not just for the land, but for the entire town. If you enjoyed the story of Jake, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.